Totally. Well, awesome. I'm super pleased to have you here, and I really appreciate you hopping
Thanks
on
for
video
having me.
and reaching out as well. Like I'm always looking for great podcast guests, especially ones who have a background like you in sport. And I just love if you wouldn't mind just taking a few moments to just tell folks. I'll put your link to the YouTube video for sure in the comments, which is pretty awesome. But I'd love to hear sort of your intro into endurance sports, if you wouldn't mind.
Ooh, well, I started running when I was younger, primarily because I'd split up with a girlfriend, mid-20s, had a lot of time, and was starting to get moobs, man boobs. And so my dad was something called a Hash House Harrier, who I believe are fairly big in the States. And I figured out that was probably the easiest thing to do, to have some kind of fitness without having to actually do any proper fitness. But really love running. And so from there, kind of got drawn into the club system, kind of chasing marathons. I was working with a big consultancy at the time, and they were doing a charity event of all doing the London Marathon, and really fell in love with that distance for a number of years until obstacle racing came along. Kind of fell in love with that, the excitement of it, joined a team. But then after a year or two, it became quite apparent that I really was meant to be a runner and not an obstacle athlete. Certainly had the legs of an obstacle athlete, but not an upper body of it. And so, and then for the last 5 years, really been drawn more into the ultra scene, partly for the story, partly because it's just quite hard to have new challenges at even shorter distances, but from marathon and down. But it was the appeal, partly because I've got my own podcast and trying to find something new to talk about, but also there's so many different directions you can take your running in when you go into ultra, or more to trail, and so I've really been trying to do anything I find interesting or inspiring or hard or different since then.
Oh wow! Okay. Awesome. Well, perfect timing, because I feel like people are really into that these days. 10 years ago, people would have said, you've got 3 things to choose from and be happy. This is it. Right.
Yeah.
I love it. And definitely for us, as I mentioned to you since you found us through our interview with Sabra, our athletes are kind of following that same trajectory, which has been, what's a way to get in? What's an organized, sort of socially acceptable way to be an endurance athlete with a community, get a good vibe, explore. And then as people evolve and move down the spectrum, they are doing just that, myself included, trying to find something more than just, doing the same thing over, but faster, or doing the same thing over, but in a different place. I think one of the really big appeals of ultra running is just that, you just don't know what you're going to get. The duration of the race means that, weather's a factor, timing, time zone, depending where you're racing. The elevation can get into the way, and all of a sudden there's like all these different dimensions of a race. So even if you did the same race 3 or 4 years in a row, it's never the same race, just by virtue of that. So I think there's also something really appealing in that process as well. And I honestly read the race reports, and I'm just like, wow, that's some pretty epic stuff.
It's also quite nice to not be judged in the same way, because people are so aware of what a good 5K time or a marathon time or even an Ironman time is, that if you go back to your group of friends, back to the office, and you've done a marathon, what's the first question? What was your time?
Right.
And that doesn't happen in ultras in the same way, because times aren't as relevant. As you said, conditions change, terrain changes. And so it's quite nice to be able to, you can do a race without that pressure, but also you can set your own challenge and not feel that you're living up to anyone else's expectations or judgment, because actually finishing is, for a lot of people, the main achievement.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. I think that's one of the things that I hear back from people all the time in terms of the appeal, is just the dynamic. Like everyone's just so pumped to be there and just enjoying it and like living their story out loud. I feel like when we talk about performance from a time perspective, that brings all that focus inside, right? So if you and I are both doing the London Marathon and we both have our own time goals, we meet in the corral. Well, those time goals are likely more than not pretty ambitious for us. So we're like inside our own heads, like I'm thinking about what am I going to do at this turn or this hill, this aid station? Am I ready? Like, is that really cramping in my leg? Oh no, the person behind me is just peeing on my leg, like, cause they don't want to go. That's awesome. Great. Hey, Marathon Corral. And you're in this tight spot and you're totally internally focused. Whereas I feel like from the ultra side, everyone is just exuding, positivity, energy. It's such a different experience. We always joke on the team about, we have a thing called the 4 keys of race execution. We talk about staying inside your own box, like, taking care of what you can control. But you also, one of the reasons for that is because everyone else around you, it looks like you're about to get into a fight, right? Like everyone's just angry and sullen face. And these are my people. This is my tribe. Like, we all journeyed here. Who are you? And it's like the only time we get to talk, and nobody talks to each other at all. So it's really, I think, eye-opening as we evolve. I think as athletes, as an athletic community, from sports from a performance side to saying, hey, sport is meant to be fun, social, adventurous, and let's find really neat ways to do it. So I'm super proud of the industry, and everyone's sort of moving more to that sort of off-road adventure side. So what if you give people kind of a taste of your history, which would you say was like the most adventurous race you did, whether it was your performance or the course?
It partly depends how you define adventure. I mean, the big one is probably the Marathon des Sables, which is a lot better known in the UK than potentially anywhere else in the world. But that's a 5-day, multi-day across the Sahara Desert, or 5-6 day, where you average about a marathon a day. So that's probably one of the most extreme. But then I've run marathons in Afghanistan where you just don't know what you're going to get yourself into. The course hasn't even been designed when you're flying out there, because the race director is on the same plane as you and is going to figure it out once he arrives. But I've raced the Beer Mile as well for England.
Okay.
And that is, in terms of adventure, I mean, that is something completely new, because even when I was doing things like the Marathon des Sables, you follow a lot of the same rules that you do for training for a marathon or for an ultra, because you still got your same training blocks. You still have your long days and your intervals, your strength work, and you just change partly the periodization and also the focus of that. Whereas something like the Beer Mile, where I've never run a mile outside of a Beer Mile. So to me, that's beyond a sprint. And then also having the pressure, the crowds, the strategy of the beers, the technique of the bottles. I mean, that was really an interesting summer where I was trying to get fast for a course of 10 weeks. Yeah, and I think it's good every now and then to just have something like that, where you try something completely new, because actually you learn things about yourself, but you learn things about a slightly different sport that you can often then bring back to the sport that you might see as your main.
Yeah. No, I totally appreciate that. I have zero interest in doing a Beer Mile. Anytime I eat something and then run, I have like a list of things I cannot eat before I go on a run, and I'm pretty sure beer would be high up there on the front end for sure. But watching that stuff happen is amazing. Like, it has all the things that I'm envious of. People who can drink beer, like stuff like that. People who can run so fast, and then running so fast and drinking beer. That's pretty impressive.
I wouldn't rule beer out though as an option, because strangely enough, I did the Comrades Marathon, ultra marathon in South Africa, which is just over a double.
Right.
And my stomach completely went, and I didn't know what to do, because I am quite a traditionalist when it comes to my nutrition. It tends to be quite, shot blocks, carby, but it wasn't working for me that day. And I just thought, let's follow Camille Herron's advice. Just try a beer. And so I grabbed a Corona off someone on the side, and it worked wonders. Just that little bit of gas, that little bit of something different. Didn't drink much of it, but just that slight change for some reason got me back into my race. And so you may hate it, but have it there as an option. If you're struggling in really long events, there's something to sip and just to, introduce something new to what your stomach's experiencing.
Ooh, I like that a lot. I feel like one of the challenges a lot of athletes have on that nutrition side is they do get fairly rigid, especially when they, are taking on a new challenge. Something like this is what it's going to be. But you have to have the ability to understand at some point in time what I'm doing isn't working, and then what are your options? So I'm not against that at all. Like I think nutrition is a place where athletes don't experiment enough. Like they'll find something that they like, and by like for endurance athletes, it typically means doesn't cause problems, right? So I can eat this and it's not a problem. Like who goes to a restaurant and says, "Where do you want to eat tonight?" And like, let's go to the place where when we eat, we don't get the runs. Oh, that's great, perfect. Let's go to that place, right? No, we want something that's that's good for us. We want something that's performance oriented, something that's going to be difference maker. But that's not how people typically choose nutrition, and so they run into that problem, and they're like, okay, I'm carrying, because we're endurance athletes. I've got like a belt or a bag. I've got all this stuff, all this, sort of sunk cost. I don't want to let go of it. It's not working, but I'm still not going to let go of it. I'm at this aid station, or there's a person with a beer, or, it's like, what do I do? And it's hard for people to make that choice to try something different. But I think it's really important, especially at that stage of the game when what do you have left to lose? Right. Like could you possibly feel any worse? It's hard to say, so.
And I think it is worth in some training runs, just particularly in your longer runs, just do some whack things with your stomach, just to get used to having, you can train your stomach certainly, but actually it's good to be out on the trails and to be facing real stomach issues or out on the roads and having to deal with clenching or having to deal with whatever it may be, because unless you've practiced these scenarios that you don't want to happen, when they do happen, it not only does it dominate you physically, but mentally it just completely takes you out of your game unless you've thought, I've done this before. I'll be okay.
Totally. I agree. Right. That's the advantage of experience that people have over you. Say, how's that? How is John, still so fast? Look how old he is. He's still so fast. Like, well, John's made hundreds of mistakes, right? He's off his list to get here. You're still in that learning process, reinventing the wheel, right? So if you can challenge yourself in that regard, running at different times of day, running at different types of food or fluid situations, whatever it is, right? Some people will look at that and say, this has been a failed workout because it was awful. But, some of my best workouts have come in those spaces. I think, particularly when we think more about long running, or in the endurance stuff, it's all part of the adventure. The odds of something, the longer the race gets, the odds of something going wrong increase exponentially, right? That's just the way that it is. So your ability to roll with those punches and do that stuff is great. We do a challenge here inside the team called Ultrame. You probably heard of David Goggins, the Navy SEAL, right? So he's got his 4 and 48 challenge, right? So 4 miles every 4 hours in 48 hours gets you 48 miles, just about an ultra, which is a great intro for people, I feel like.
Yeah.
So we did a multi-sport play on that last year. We're doing it again this year, which is you've got to exercise 1 hour every 4 hours. So it ends up being, 4 miles is shorter than typically for most people than an hour. It ends up being a little bit more. So we do, we let people choose their modality. So, we do typically, most people do 1 hour of running and then 1 hour of cycling. So it's 1 hour of something every 4 hours. And so, we start off at 8 p.m. and then it's, midnight 4, and then the second night. I think that's really a glimpse, at least for the people who participated last year, at exercise over time at different times of day and the nutrition side, because most of us are so controlled. But hey, I get up in the morning, I exercise from 5 to 6. Like the stomach's always the same. I always feel the same. This is what the weather's like, give or take sunlight. But that was a real eye opener. So I think also as you're messing with your stomach, it's not just, what are you putting in, but also the when portion of it as well, which can be really helpful,
Yeah. And it also teaches you how weird your body is and how these things like second waves and how energy can be hard to predict. And it goes to explain why you can have shocking races sometimes, because during that 48-hour period, no doubt you will have a time when you think you should be absolutely knackered in your flying, and a time when you think you should be absolutely cruising and you're really struggling. And it's really good to just try these things, and they all goes in the experience bank that makes you a stronger athlete next time.
Totally. Yeah. I just did a challenge on Saturday, like a long bike ride. And in the middle of it, I figured, I did the math, and I was like, I think in the middle, a couple hours is going to be my low point. But as I get to the end, I'll pick it back up again. That did not happen. Like in the middle, I still felt great. But at the end, I felt even worse than I thought I would possibly feel. And I barely dragged myself to the finish line. But that really sort of made me reflect for a minute, to sort of be like, when you're doing these endurance events, you really just have to kind of roll with it. When it feels good, you just roll with it. And when it doesn't feel good, you're like, what can I do? When I had one of my first worst Ironman races ever, which, back then was like the longest thing I'd ever done. I probably in my 5th or 6th one, and I was just having a terrible time. It was my stomach. And having a terrible time, and saw one of my teammates who was someone I looked up to, a bit of a mentor, on the side of the road. And I was like, hey man, have you ever just not finished a race? Not because I didn't think I could finish, but just, from a physical standpoint, my stomach was just, that's it. And his advice was just, first of all, he said no, very quickly, no gray areas here for Patrick. But he also just said what was really important. It stuck with me forever since, which was no highs or no lows. So like, just don't think like this is the best ever, it's going to be like this. And don't think this is the worst ever. You just keep it in the middle of those two ranges, and, roll with it when you can. I think that's just so important, understanding, not making assumptions based off of where you are, but just saying like, okay, things are good, let's go, and things are not good. Okay. But we're still going to go, like, finish line.
Are you a never DNFer then?
Oh, I've never thought of that. I don't think I am. I think I am. I don't think I've ever DNF'd. I've DNF'd lots of things, but when it comes to a race, I think I pretty much dragged myself to the end, against all intelligence. There's no, there's probably a couple times I should have said stop, I definitely won't give myself that. Like, I don't wear that as a badge of honor, by any means. I think some people make it as like, oh, you're so tough or something. No, I just don't know any better. And I've definitely paid the price.
I do find that fascinating though, because some people almost need to have that rule to force themselves to get through hard times, even if it's to the detriment of them potentially their physical health long term, whereas others don't. And I've never really decided on what the right strategy is, whether it is good to have rules like that. I've always finished ultras, but when I was doing the obstacle race season, we used to have a league where you'd be racing every week, sometimes 2 races at a weekend. And if a race wasn't going well, I'd just drop out, because I could have finished, but it would have just tired me out, and I'd much rather save it for the next day. And that's completely changed my approach to races, in that knowing why I'm doing each thing, and having A goal, B goals, C goals. But then if it came to an ultra, I think I probably would finish no matter what, unless it was a training run. I think I'd still, yeah.
Right. Well, I think that's an interesting point. I was about to say that as well. I feel like I have not DNF'd an event, but I have definitely DNF trainings, and I have DNF seasons. Like I have trained myself into a spot where I'm like, now I've got this Achilles problem. I'll be back next year. Or, I had a bike accident. See you in a year. And so I think if I'm able to get to a race, typically, all things being equal, I have the fitness, and I have hopefully some of the mental toughness that's going to get me through that event. But in training, for sure, there's definitely, I think being able to walk away, the hardest, one of my athletes says, one of the hardest workouts you have to do is the one that you don't, right? That you just say, I'm not working out today. It's just not, it's not going to be good for me. And that's super hard. On race day, I think most people can say like, ooh, finish line. I can imagine it, I can hear it. But in training, I think that's far more important, to be able to say, this is not my day. I think because on race day, and I'm sure you've been there before as well, like you'll be climbing a hill or running somewhere and you're thinking to yourself, this is the bottom. Like it doesn't get any worse than this right now. Like I am, running uphill for you, running up this dune, I'm imagining, in this ridiculous heat. You know what I mean? Trying to get through it. It's like day 3 and like, I've got 2 more days. This is ridiculous. Like what possibly, and then, it's just the way the human mind works. Like it can't stay that bad. I feel like this is a 10 out of 10 in terms of pain. It can't stay a 10 forever. Eventually it becomes a 9 and an 8, or there's another hill. And I think just having the perseverance to get through that little spot, then you're like, oh, it's not so bad, especially if we're not running all out. It's a different thing. Like for example, on the beer mile, I imagine the pain and discomfort associated with that probably outweighs any endurance thing. At least that's how I feel. What's your thought on that in terms of the high intensity discomfort versus the endurance?
Well, I mean, weirdly, when I was racing, because I've only done it 1 year, I actually forgot to run hard. So I was so nervous about the drinking side of things because it's so gaseous that I got to the end and thought, wow, I'm barely out of breath. I probably should have been sprinting the whole way. But yeah, that's quite strange because it's more that you feel like you're going to drown, and you tell yourself I have to do each one in one go, because if I don't, then I'll stop, and then it all goes. Then all bets are off, and it's just that the 3rd or the 4th beer where you can't breathe and you think this is never ending. I could drown here. I could drown here. You won't, but it feels that way, and it.
Right.
Yeah. It's strange because you drink something like that, you take the first bend, and one burp later, and suddenly you're feeling back to as good as new again. So it's it's quite an odd one. I'd say in the longer runs. I mean, when I did the Marathon des Sables, the second day, which was supposedly meant to be the easy day in our heads, the first day. We did a dunes day, which is really tough because every step you're sinking in, and you can't really get a sense of distances as easily because it's such at least even when you're running up a hill, you know what distance you're covering approximately. Whereas sand dunes, they just change the whole time. So actually on a map, they've got no sense of how steep the dunes will be, what direction they'll go. So then the second day, which was meant to be the quicker, easier day, a huge number of us fell apart because we almost underestimated how hard the day before had been and thought, right, now we can actually run fast. And that I was forced to walk in that one, which when I wanted to run, you do walk up some dunes depending on the technique you need, and that really. That killed me because I've been building up to this event for a year and a half, maybe longer in terms of it had always been on my bucket list. And so to day 2 be walking in a race is almost, it's hard to look ahead and think how is the rest of this day, let alone what about the double long day? How is that going to be good? But actually, again, as we were saying, experience, I'd previously done a training run where I'd done back-to-back 30-something milers. And on the first training run, I'd fallen apart in that for no reason. I couldn't predict it. I couldn't understand why afterwards. But I told myself, it wasn't a race as well, but it wasn't an A race. And I told myself, like, I'm ruined today, but I can't quit. I can quit on the start line tomorrow morning because that's when I'll know if it's not sensible to run. Like if I'm physically strained too much, and I gave myself that chance to recover. And the next morning I actually felt absolutely fine and smashed through it. And it wasn't, if I hadn't had done that, I don't know whether I'd have been as strong on that second day in the desert, where I was actually crying to myself. I was feeling under my shades because you've got to wear these sunglasses to protect your eyes. I was just crying to myself about how much of a failure it all become. And it was only that experience having that in my back pocket to pull out and think, this happened before and you recovered, that really kept me going and gave me hope to just keep on going and wait to get through the wall, which eventually did happen.
Wow. That's awesome. Because you're right. I think what you really brought up there is important, is there's the physical side, and there's also that sort of mental, emotional side of encountering that difficulty. We race for that, right? That's why we're there, is to be challenged. And sometimes that challenge is just so acute or so enormous or so, unfathomable, that it becomes a real barrier. Yeah, totally. I think you talk about training for a year and a half. I think about sometimes for those events, you've been an athlete for years, decades, to this point, getting to a place where you can do something. So you've built this history. And I think people, one of my favorite parts about the ultra C and the endurance stuff, I think a lot of people in other sports, if we just said marathons, well, then like you mentioned, there's times and there's some sort of informal pecking order. But for someone who can run, so fast and go, 2.5 hours or something, it's not any easier for them than someone who's running a 5-hour race. Like everyone's working hard. If you went to that person who won the marathon and said, hey, would you rather run, with the last place finisher? It's going to be 7.5 hours. You're just going to run. The heck no. Like they would never want to do that. So everybody has, sort of different levels of difficulty. And I think, like you said, sort of taking that pressure off and saying, all right, but I'm going to put this to tomorrow. I'll be in a better frame of mind and come back out. I think it's just so important. I think on some level, that's a lot of trust in what you've built, like your fitness and the system, and just saying, we're going to, take this out of it. Right. I don't know. I remember we've got a good friend that I raced with for years that retired, I'm pretty sure, at the finish line of almost every race we ever did together. And then the next morning I'd see him in the registration line for the next year. I'm like, are you here to morally support someone or tell them to go away? What are you doing? He was already signing up for the next one. But in that moment, our ability to make decisions so impacted. Well, anyway, this has been awesome so far, but I do want to talk about why we're here as well. I want to touch base on Caffeine Bullet and kind of tell people a little bit about it. So I went online, caffeinebullet.com, saw the site, saw the chews, look awesome. And I'm a big caffeine person myself. People like to tell me that I eat coffee. Probably not so great. But that's the one thing I can take pretty much any time of day and be all right. And so I'm super curious to kind of hear the origin story of how you managed to move into caffeine and like, for example, why caffeine, and so on.
Well, I mean, caffeine's been probably my wonder drug for the majority of the time I've raced. And it did seem when I first started running that not many people really used it, even though I don't think there's been any major revelations in its usefulness for athletes. But I used to clip out little caffeine tabs of pills that I'd take, and I'd sit the night before a race and cut round these tabs because I couldn't find anything that I thought was a good product to use. There's caffeine gels, but a lot of them are very weak, 30, 50 milligrams caffeine.
Gotta have like 6 gels to make 1 cup of coffee. You're like,
yeah. I mean, there are stronger gels now, actually, particularly things like Cis. But also, I had raced where normally the point at which I want caffeine is the point at which I no longer want gels, and so there's nothing worse than if you've taken a gel and you suddenly need your caffeine. And you think I can't have another gel for 20 minutes because it would just overload my stomach. Or you're in that position where you're really struggling in your race. And you think, right, I'm going to have to eat this gloop just to get the caffeine bit in it.
Yeah.
So that's why I decided to try creating my own product. And turns out when you chew anything, it helps the chemicals being absorbed in your mouth, in your cheeks, in your throat, because there's the blood vessels are very close to the skin. So I set on a chew as a way to have something that was intense, but also would then mean it kicks kind of 5-10 minutes faster than anything you'd swallow like a gel. But yeah, then just had to try and find, how do I do this, which is manufacturing. It's interesting actually what people's perceptions are of how easy it is or isn't to create products. So I just had to scour factory after factory. I've only found 2 factories in the whole of Europe that could make this product. One in Poland, one in Northeast England. And then did a crowdfunder and created the product basically. So we've been going for 3 years, and we're now used by, interestingly enough, a friend of mine, Jason Slav, who I was racing in the Marathon des Sables. He was the guy I was having a great time with on the second day, not paying any attention to my pace, that then caused me to fall apart. I've been sending them out to him to get him out in the States, and they're now used for any kind of sport or whenever people would have a coffee or an energy drink, and just trying to get the word out more than anything else.
Okay, well, that's fantastic. Do you have one there? You got someone like laying around somewhere?
Yeah, I've actually been. So this morning I've been doing some calls with India to talk about bringing the product there.
Okay.
And so I've taken a huge amount of them because every call you feel like you've got to represent the brand, right? And you want to show them what the chew is, but they're quite strong. They're 100 milligrams, which is a small Red Bull's 77, an espresso's 50 to 70. So I've been absolutely bouncing off the walls this morning, and so I'm not going to have another one now because it'll put me in the danger zone, really. But,
that's right. How many of me do you see right now, David?
But what's interesting about caffeine is it's because it used to be banned because it's such a performance enhancer, but unfortunately it's not an equal opportunities drug, and 10% of people don't actually respond to caffeine at all. So
that is like the saddest story I've heard all day. I am so glad I am not one of those people. Sorry. Well,
I'd be really interested to know of the marathon runners, your Kipchoge's, your Bekele's, if they all respond to caffeine in the same way, because we're almost reaching the point where it's so competitive at distances like that, where getting a 2-3% advantage is the difference between winning every marathon in the world and not even podiuming. So it does seem unfortunate that not everyone responds to caffeine, because that could be the biggest determinant of whether someone could be the best runner in the world. But yeah, it's part of why I'm trying to speak to people like your good self is also just to help educate people. And like caffeine is absorbed in 3 different ways, in 3 different levels based on people's DNA. So you can get DNA tests now to see how you process it, but you probably know from trying coffee yourselves. But also people take the way we have caffeine, the concentration we have in races. A lot of people will use caffeine and it will benefit them, but actually the doses that in studies they've shown that are the optimal dose is a massive amount. It's between 3 and 6 milligrams of caffeine per kilo that you weigh. So if you're the average male, say you weigh 80 kilograms or so, you're looking at 240 milligram minimum caffeine to get your optimal dose. And if you haven't practiced that, if you do that on race day, it is enough that it will spin you out. You won't. It will overwhelm you. And you certainly shouldn't do that if you've got a dicky heart, because it is a huge amount. But that is why caffeine is something we have to practice and figure out how it works for us, and really rehearse in our B races, in our training, those concentrations to get an understanding of what it feels like and how much help it can be.
Totally. I think to touch back on a couple of things you said, for sure on the excess caffeine. So I did the same thing. I used to have, people thought I was like a little drug dealer, right? I'd take like a plastic baggie. This has a bunch of like GoPro mounts in it, but I would put like all the pills I needed, and I kind of get them down to the corner, and then I'd break the bag and like tie it off so I could just bite the bag and like eat all the pills out at once. I wouldn't have to handle all the pills.
Clever.
Right. Totally. Well, but so one of those was a caffeine pill, and so I'd be 6 hours or 7 hours or 8 hours into an event where my heart rate's been coming down. I'm, running on low blood sugar, kind of feeling low. I'm like, well, I need some energy. And you take one of those, it's like having the biggest cup of coffee for the first time ever. And I remember riding my bike and like shaking, being like, oh, it must be so cold out. And I'm like looking at the sun, there's sweat coming off my face. And my system had just been overwhelmed by the sheer amount of caffeine that had hit me. So since that point in time, definitely going to more of that dose. And for me, I look at it, the way I strategize for a race is that if I'm doing an 8-hour race or 10-hour race, I kind of introduce caffeine sort of at the halfway point and then continue it so that it builds up in my system over time. Strategically being A, keep me mentally engaged. B, also, keep my heart rate up over time, helps keep everything going, has been helpful. But the other part I wanted to touch on, because people ask me those questions, I put that in. The other part I want to touch on, though, which you mentioned earlier, was separating. And I think that's so important. So one of the challenges that people have with their nutrition as well is they say, hey, in triathlon, people will take, they'll be like, oh, inside here, I have, like 400 calories and so much salt and whatever else I have. And to your point, anytime you want to eat something, or let's say, oh, I need a little bit more salt for my stomach. Well, it's all in one. You can't break it up, right? So particularly when people need salt, for example, I always have them carry salt externally, because if you need a little bit of extra salt to help, get the fluid out of your gut, you can't drink more with some salt in it to get a lot. You're just sort of reinforcing the problem. So I love the idea of having that caffeine separate from a food item, yet still orally introduced, like you mentioned. So we get those signals right away. The brain's like, hey, caffeine is on its way. Like, we're in a good spot, right? As opposed to saying, I think one of the challenges we have in endurance racing is when everything goes into the stomach, we're basically saying, I'm going to put some fluids in, I'm going to put some of this other stuff in, all the stuff, I'm going to put it in my stomach, I'm going to mix it around, and it's going to be great, right? And it works on a Sunday. You and I can go out for a run and we could have some donuts. Like, it would be great. We could run. And then on race day, you can't, like, it never turns out the same. So I love the idea of the separate piece.
So what would because one of the frustrating things about all research is that it's driven by primarily companies. And this is something that when we get bigger, I want to actually do some proper studies. But how do you mentioned that you'd start taking caffeine from halfway and then try and top up, because this is my own personal observation, because there are no studies on repeat use of caffeine. And from my point of view, you can't, once you start, you can't stop. They're like Pringles, because you will crash. And so it is hard in longer races to really get the right strategy where you're not risking going too early or having to keep on loading to such an extent that it becomes too much. And I think that's the real challenge. I mean, when I did Comrades, I wanted to try and get 4 potential different doses. And so I started with like half a chew, then a 1 chew. And that was only 3 doses. 3 doses. And then ended with 2 chews. But like, when you say you kind of just, you've tried to top up, like, do you have a sense of what amount you start with and then how frequently you add on to that?
That's a great question. So I've never really done the math particularly on it. I just start saying, for example, if I'm taking the shot blocks or the gels, I just transition. I'm start by halfway. I start saying, instead of the regular gel, I'm going to have the one with the caffeine in it. So I probably end up taking about probably like I guess like a gel has 50 milligrams. Maybe like sort of like a cup of coffee, almost an hour as I go over that second half. So for example, in an Ironman, second half of the bike, so 2 hours and change, is more caffeinated. And that's give or take what you can eat. And I think that's the other part to keep in mind for people. I'll say 2 hours there, and then a 3-hour marathon is mostly caffeine food. But, I'm having a block a mile or something like that. So I'm having a full sleeve of blocks and say, 45 minutes or an hour or whatever it is. But then there's that odd, I didn't eat this one. Like, it didn't feel good right now. So I'm not I'm going to wait a bit. So it's not like I wrote this out and then I just have to cram it all in. but that's the general plan, is to keep that up. Because I find that we talked earlier about some of that mental fatigue and so on. I think that's also a huge determinant. I think there's an argument, the whole central governor theory, people talk about that with Noakes, but I think a huge part of it also falls on the other side of the spectrum. So not speed, how fast can you go, etc. I think it's on the other side as well, where we say like, how long can I do this? And that's where I think it moves from like 80% physical, 20% mental to the inverse, and we start saying this is all mental. If you and I running a fast 5K, that's brutal, right? But if we say, hey, we're going to run for 5 days, that's also challenging, but it's a very different enterprise. And so it's not who's running the fastest right now, it's who can slow down the least. And in that conversation, it's very different. And so for me, I kind of look at it like that. The caffeine becomes something, whether it's a treat, like I'm like, ooh, I get a little, I get one of these, later, which I like. Or it becomes, sometimes it's just that edge. Like when I look at some of the longer races where I've been successful, it's not that, in the last 2 miles, I, like a professional wrestler, like ripped off my shirt and like ran to the finish line with this awesome display of physical strength. It was ugly, and I don't have a good looking finisher photo anywhere, like they're all awful. Like I don't even have run pictures where it looks like I'm running. All of my feet are always both on the ground. People are like, how do you run with both feet on the ground? I'm like, it's an extremely high performance technique. Don't ask me why. But I think that it's that little bit of an edge for sure. And for me, like I said, it's kind of like the reward side, but also I think one of the reasons why I also like the concept of the chew, not for folks watching this in the future, I've not had one yet. But I think one of the reasons why I do like that is, to your point, it's you're not all or nothing. Like I could put it in, and be like, and I'm like, no, I don't really feel it. I can get rid of the chew if I want to. If I drink a whole cup of Coke and say that was a bad idea, I don't have a lot. I've got one recourse, but I'm not going to stick my finger down the back of my throat. That's it. There's no turning back. And so I think one of the neat things that I could see happening with Caffeine Bullet in terms of using it and so on is that you kind of get, like you mentioned, testing, like, hey, I think, it's a tough day or I'm going to go out for a 3-hour run. I'm going to pop one in at 2 hours and be like, hey, like, what's the initial response to that? Where are you? Especially if you're a caffeine drinker, you're pretty, it's not the X factor. And I will say my least favorite conversations with athletes are when they tell me what is inside their bottles, because some of the stuff that people put inside here is ridiculous. Like I would much rather have a caffeine bullet than drink a Red Bull. Like I'm like, there's a bunch of stuff in there. I'm not really sure. I'm like party, like I was in Central Asia for a while as well, not for racing. And, went over to Thailand. I remember Red Bull before Red Bull was everywhere. It was not for running. It was partying hard,
Well, I mean, interesting enough, if we have a good race, we often go out with caffeine bullets afterwards to keep the night continuing. But yeah, totally. Probably a similar reason with Red Bull. Yeah.
Well, I guess, right? Yeah, I don't know. So I think just to kind of touch on this. So I think from a planning perspective, I look at it and say, one thing is like, if it's a race, then it's like, okay, second half of my day. If it was a multi-stage race, for example, then I probably would think about what's the macro on that. I'm going to need, in day 3, 4, 5, or whatever else you come up with next. Please don't tell me I don't want to know about it. That I need more caffeine in that last day. So I probably would have some sort of graded plan as well, as you mentioned. Like the first day I'd have some, and then so on, because I don't want to overwhelm my system as well.
Yeah, and that's where more studies would be really interesting, because I mean they have shown that caffeine in high doses speeds up recovery as well. So it increases the speed at which glycogen returns to the muscles. Unfortunately, the level of caffeine that is for is too high for me for it to be worthwhile, I believe. And they've not tested at lower levels. But when they've looked at things like caffeine tolerance, strangely, some studies have shown that cutting down caffeine in advance is useful for an improved benefit on race day. But they've also shown other studies of users where they've not cut down and they've still received the benefit of caffeine during their races.
Right.
So there just isn't. This is why we say try it out in advance for yourself, because it doesn't seem that there's yet a firm understanding which has been proven by some good scientific data. And so my word of advice generally is if you need to concentrate as part of your race, which in anything really long you do, because you just need to be aware of what you're doing and you know how your body feels. I'd always recommend then cutting caffeine out in advance, because it repeatedly having caffeine does change the hormones that your body's creating, and it reduces the amount of some useful ones. Well, not exactly hormones, but things that are very similar to hormones. And so, yeah, if you need to be training really hard the whole time, but you don't need to be that alert on race day, then it might be worth keeping up your caffeine use throughout. But otherwise, I would recommend cutting down for at least 4 days before you race.
Yeah, I don't. That's great advice, and I think to your point, I think everyone's got to kind of wrestle with that animal themselves. I've tried both. I generally do drink coffee into a race, but I do cut down the total consumption. I would say that on my perspective, during that taper period, depending on how long your taper is, I do believe that regular athletes who are trying to fit in all their endurance training and still, try and get married and run a company or, be awesome, whatever else you do, that we tend to drink coffee to sort of, help get through the day. But what we're essentially doing is we're masking our body's response on some level to the training stress. And so I found, for me, for the longest time, and I'm so glad my wife is not here right now, because for the longest time when I first was, starting Endurance Nation and working and training, and we had, young kids and everything, I would train during the day and work during the day, and then also work at night, put the kids to bed, and I'd work, have a big cup of coffee and do the whole thing. And I was like, I must be one of these people that only needs 3 hours of sleep, like those people you read about. And then I had a unfortunate bike crash, cracked my hip, and then had to, wheelchair, and then had to do this whole recovery thing. So I couldn't train, couldn't do anything. And guess what? I was sleeping like 10 hours a night. And my wife was like, this is you without the caffeine. You need this rest. You just have been, because of the caffeine, you've not been paying attention to your body. So long story short, I think some of the benefits for reducing that caffeine intake or eliminating it if you get there and that taper is just so you can be like, oh, hey, I think I do need a nap right now. And like, in pre-race, I'll take that nap. Or, what, maybe 5.5 hours of sleep, not exactly optimal. And so having that, using it as an opportunity to get more in tune with your body and the stress, the total training stress load you have, I think is also super beneficial.
And I do, and it's a bit bizarre thing to say, maybe as someone who runs a caffeine company, I do think as a society, we use caffeine too much. And it is a powerful drug, a really powerful drug, but it stops being a powerful drug if you use it all the time. And so if you are trying to use its benefit, then save its power for hard training sessions, for, when as you say, life is busy, but there are times that you really need to get something done. And there are other times when you're just used to having coffee in the morning to basically function in the way that you would be functioning without caffeine if you hadn't been drinking the whole time. And so that's where, you can see the size of my mug here. I've got a pint mug that I have my cups of tea in, big British and all that. Right. But I do have decaf coffee when I drink, so that when I have the caffeine, it really gets me going.
I like the mug. I like it's got the dimples like the golf balls. That's what the time to travel from the tabletop to your mouth. It's more aerodynamic. Every sip of coffee is that much faster. Awesome. Well, so I'll, in the bio, I'll put all the stuff up for folks so they can, go over to the website and check it out for sure. And I look forward to trying some myself as well. Across, the course of this season and so on. Where can people find it for right now? Like, where can they go? What's the best way to look?
Well, caffeinebullet.com sells to the US, or we're on Amazon. And if you're, for your listeners that aren't US focused, we are on Amazon on Saudi Arabia, Canada, Australia, Singapore. So between those two, and we will be in Walmart, I think, shortly. Although I keep on, I don't know, something goes wrong with their technology. I don't know if it's me or them. So in theory, we'll be there soon. But I was maybe there about a year ago, and we still haven't worked out the tech. So we'll see. You know,
all right.
It seems like God's trying to stop us, but yeah.
You're an endurance athlete. They don't know what they're missing. You're still going to be there when they figure it out. So
indeed.
Yeah. Okay. Fantastic. Well, good stuff. I'll send people to the website for sure. It was a real pleasure to meet you. You know, I love brands and stories behind brands from folks who are athletes. I myself fall into that category of, I'm not going to tell someone to do something unless I've done something like it or or something equally dumb or challenging, because I think there was a perspective of what it means to really use something and bring it to life. And we don't have a ton of that in the endurance sports space. So I do appreciate it. And kudos to you for starting it up. Like, I can only imagine the challenges. So yeah, I look forward to getting some and helping, super grateful to spread the word and so on. And you and I can, follow up via email and figure out what next steps are. All right.
Yeah. And if people have any questions about any of the races I've mentioned, or are looking for advice on other things, that obviously Coach Patrick for your coaching, but for details of those races in different countries, then feel free at any time to kind of get in touch on Bad Boy Running on Instagram or Facebook.
Okay, that's perfect. Yeah, I'll put it all in the bio and tell them, and I'll definitely share it to our Ultra Squad that we have here inside the team. They're they're all spun up now that the Barkley Marathon ended, just after 2 days, the little bit of disappointment. So they're definitely planning their next challenge and assault. So I'm sure some of the international stuff will be on the radar as well.
Brilliant. Well, lovely to speak to you.
Cheers. Same. And best of luck with the wedding planning. I hope you guys manage to pull it together soon. All right. Stay safe.
Cheers, Patrick.
Cheers.
Cool.